What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and this is a pretty exciting one. This is going to be another tournament report, as the YGO from Zero Retro Tournament 5 just wrapped up the other day. You can check out the live stream that I did for that with commentary of the finals match. It was really insane, so I really recommend checking it out if you want to see some great Critter gameplay. But this tournament was very exciting for a variety of reasons. We actually had a new deck reach top 3 status, and it's one that is very interesting and very polarizing. So I am very excited to dive into that and sort of discuss what I think it means for the metagame of Critter going forward, as I don't think it's an understatement to say that this tournament will greatly change how Critter is played going forward and what the meta for Critter format looks like. But before diving into the results, as always, if you enjoyed the video, please do leave a like down below, and also be sure to subscribe if you like Critter content. Especially, we've got a bunch of Critter videos on this channel, and we also have a bunch of other Retro Yu-Gi-Oh content as well. So definitely subscribe if you're interested in that. And also, if you want to play Critter format or any of the future retro tournaments that we're going to be holding in the Discord in the future, be sure to join that Discord. Link will be in the description down below. It's a great place to find games in these old and often obscure formats. But with that out of the way, let's dive into this tournament, and let's start with the deck breakdown here. So for the deck type representation, of course, there were 21 players, and the deck that was most represented among those 21 players was Mass Control. Wasn't quite over 50% like it has been in past tournaments, but, 8 players playing Mass Control is still pretty good, over a third of the people playing this deck. The next highest represented deck was Muka Muka Turbo, which makes sense. The deck's been seeing a major upswing in recent events, and it's a deck that a lot of people are sort of drawn to. It's very aggressive. It sort of serves as a nice counter to the more controlling Mass Control style of gameplay that you can find in Critter. So people are tinkering with this and trying it out a lot more than they have in the past. And I really enjoy this deck, so I'm happy to see it get pretty well represented in this tournament, even if it didn't actually make the top 3. Next up, we've got Exodia with 2 players. Now, this is a lot less than it has seen in the past, and neither of these 2 players were actually able to bring their Exodia decks to the top 3 of the event. And I don't necessarily think that this is a death knell for Exodia. I think that, with only 2 players out of 21 players playing it, it is very likely that it wouldn't make it to the top, even if it is still tier 1. So I still think Exodia is in the tier 1 slot, and I think that honestly, after this event, it may see a resurgence, as in future events, people might not be as prepared for Exodia as they have been in the past. So still definitely a deck to watch out for and potentially play if you want to do well in one of these tournaments. Just wasn't able to convert in this one. Next up, we've got Goblin Control, and this was a very interesting sort of deck that popped up here. Goblin Controls existed in the past. I've made some videos on this deck. I'm not the biggest fan of it, but it did actually do somewhat well in this tournament. And it is a deck that, people might try and experiment with more in the future, given its success here. So actually, that is kind of a another downside for playing Exodia in the near future. But I do still think Exodia still is tier 1. And honestly, I still feel like Goblin Control is just a weaker sort of version of a Mass Control deck. But we'll get into my thoughts on that once we discuss the top 3 lists. Next up, we've got the one-of decks, the decks that only one player brought to the event. First up, we've got Cannonburn. Cannonbird's a very strong deck, I think, but, just wasn't able to convert one player playing it. Makes sense that it wouldn't be able to make it. But, I do think that this doesn't necessarily have a bearing on the power of Cannon Soldier itself. And as we'll discuss in the final breakdown for the event, I think that Cannon Soldier is a card that people are going to be looking at a lot more in the future. Even though it is still played at 1 copy in pretty much every deck right now, I think that more decks will play more of it in the future after this event. We've also got a Harpy deck, which is pretty neat. I like Harpies. I think it's like a solid tier 2 option in this format, even though, it could very well be Rogue, and I just got lucky while playing it. Needs more testing to find out, but I do think it's an interesting sort of deck. So happy to see that someone brought it and played it, even if it didn't actually make it to Top Cut. We've also got Black Skull Dragon Turbo. So this is like a fusion deck that's trying to play Red Eyes Black Dragon and summon Skull. Go into Black Skull Dragon, a huge fusion monster. I'm really not a fan of this variant of the fusion deck. I mean, my ideal fusion deck is sort of just a Muka Muka Turbo deck that also plays 1 copy of Polymerization to go into Twin Head. That's how I like to play a fusion deck in this format. But if you're going all in on fusion, I still think the Black Skull Dragon is not the way to go, as Red Eyes Black Dragon is unsearchable and it is a major brick. Even if you're using things like Soul Exchange, it still is quite the brick. So I'm not the biggest fan of this deck, but cool to see that one person brought it to the tournament, even though it didn't really manage to do well. We've also got Catapult OTK, which is a very interesting deck. Going aggressive with the burn with Catapult Turtle, you can assemble some decent OTKs. This deck has seen success in the past. I think it could continue to see success in the future. But, unfortunately, it didn't really manage to do it in this tournament. And lastly, the deck that has sort of set the community on fire and is really interesting to see here, we've got Labyrinth Tank Turbo. Labyrinth Tank is another fusion monster, 2400 attack, made with Cannon Soldier and Gigatech Wolf, that we're going to be talking about a lot more because, despite the fact that only one person brought this deck to the event, this deck actually managed to get second place, which is really awesome to see. So I'm expecting people to experiment with this more in the future. Now that we've discussed the deck type representation, let's get into what everyone is wanting to see here, and that is the topping lists. Because there were some spicy brews here. Obviously, the second place list is the most spicy here, but I want to start out with the third and first place lists just to talk about some interesting things about them before we dive into the deck that, really shook things up. So first off, the third place list is Goblin Control. DK0 played it. DK0 is a very good player in this format. And, as I heard it, this list was basically sort of made out of talks between DK0 and the current winner of this tournament, Palo NS, who were just trying to come up with a new deck for Critter format after some of the previous tournaments. And one card that they really focused on was Robin Goblin. Robin Goblin's a continuous trap that lets you discard a card from your opponent's hand every time you inflict battle damage on them. And so, you can go all in on this Robin Goblin strategy and just rip your opponent's hand apart. I've seen replays from this tournament with DK0 ripping like 5 cards from an opponent's hand in a very good battle phase. So I do think that, Robin Goblin has a lot of potential. I generally haven't liked it in the past because I do think it's a little bit win more, and also I think that it is susceptible to Heavy Storm. But you'll notice that DK is actually doing some interesting things to sort of play around this weakness. For instance, Fake Trap. Fake Trap's a trap that basically, when your opponent activates a card to destroy a trap or traps on your side of the field, you can activate Fake Trap and prevent it from destroying those cards. So this can counteract Heavy Storm. Unfortunately, Heavy Storm's really the only card in the format that would do that, unless you're playing Trap Masters, maybe in the side deck. So, this is kind of just 2 fake traps for 2 heavy storms, which is a bit iffy. If your opponent uses up a heavy storm and you don't have the fake trap for it, and then you draw both fake traps later, it can be a bit rough. But I do think it's very interesting innovation to make here. You'll also notice that they're not actually playing Heavy Storms in the main deck, as this does conflict with the Robin Goblins, which I do think is a pretty good choice. Other things to note, they've got 2K Defenders, Aquamators, and Giant Soldiers of Stone. These are very good. Your opponent attacks into them, you flip up Robin Goblin, and then they lose a card. So that's very, very nice. They're also playing a ton of 1800 beaters, the 7-colored fishes and the Lodgins, and they're playing things like Dark Elf and Jirai Gumo to just get even more aggressive. So I think that this monster lineup looks really good for this sort of deck. And one last card that I want to mention that's a bit of a spicy tech from DK here that I think really does work well in these circumstances is Ultimate Offering. Ultimate Offering can let you swarm the field with monsters and rip apart your opponent's hand if you know that the coast is clear. So I think that this is a really neat innovation for the deck. It also works very well with the 2K Defenders that DK is playing to pair with the Robin Goblins, as you can provide a very good defensive wall after your opponent's potentially cleared away your other monsters. It also plays very well with Fake Traps. The Fake Traps aren't just here for the Robin Goblins, they also work on the Ultimate Offerings. So I think this deck is pretty good. It's also playing 3 Solemn Judgments to insulate its continuous traps even more and insulate its plays even more to rip apart the opponent's hand. I think that this is a very good deck for Solemn Judgment. One of the sort of points of debate that arose during this tournament was, how good Solemn Judgment is really, whether it does belong in the metagame at 3 copies. And I do think that while not every deck should play Solemn Judgment, I do think that a lot of decks really do want to play it, and I think that Goblin Control is a perfect example of a deck that really does benefit from Solemn Judgment at 3 copies. But this deck wasn't the only deck in the top 3 playing Robin Goblin. Palo NS's first place list was also playing a copy of Robin Goblin, as well as a copy of Ultimate Offering, even though it does skew more towards the mass control side of things. It's also playing 3 Muka Mukas to get more aggressive, which is very nice. And this deck is just pretty sick. We saw it do great things in the finals match that I streamed the other day. And I mean, I think that finals match showed, first of all, how good a sort of like good stuff mass control deck can be, because it is very, very strong, despite a lot of people sort of, looking down on the deck a bit after the results of this tournament, given that it only really ended up with one representation in the top 3. But also, I think that this deck really does show the power of Ultimate Offering. We saw in game 1 of the finals that Paolo basically OTK'd his opponent for a ton of damage with Ultimate Offering. They set their whole hand, had a Cannon Soldier out, tributed off their entire field, searched with Witch to get more cards to tribute off, and they basically dealt like 5,500 to 6,000 damage in one turn with Ultimate Offering, which was pretty insane to see, and really awesome to see. So I think that games like that really show that Ultimate Offering has a lot of potential, and I hope that people do sort of continue to experiment with this card going forward, as I feel like this is a card that hasn't really seen much play in Critter in the past because of things like Heavy Storm, making it a lot worse. But even if it does die to Heavy Storm, if you play it well, it can come in really, really handy for you, and can be very, very good. Other than that, don't really have too much to talk about with this list in particular. You can see it in action in the finals match that I streamed. But the deck that I want to close this video out by talking about is the Labyrinth Tank Turbo deck that Falco brought to the tournament. This deck is super, super sick and super, super innovative. Like, fusion decks hadn't really been played in the past in Critter. I did bring a fusion deck to a tournament in the past, and I got 5th place in that. But, that was more just a Muka Muka Turbo deck playing one copy of Poly. This deck is going all in on the fusion strategy. You got 3 Polys, you've got 3 Cannon Soldier, 3 Gigatech Wolf, and 3 Thunder Dragon. So you can either go into Twin Head off the Thunder Dragon, or you can go into copies of Labyrinth Tank, which is a 2400 attack point fusion monster made with Cannon Soldier and Gigatech Wolf. These sorts of fusion summons give you a lot of option for extension, which oftentimes your opponent is not expecting, and also can just get more bodies on the board for Cannon Soldier, which this deck is playing 3 of. In addition, Gigatech Wolf doesn't have the worst stats in the format. 1400 defense can wall up against a lot of the format's threats, as things like Mass Sorcerer do show, so it's not the worst thing in the world, and unlike Black Skull Turbo, this card is a card that you can just summon out to attack in with, so, it's not the worst in that respect as well. Also, a good thing to note, we've got 7 Tools of the Ben in the main deck, and this is really to punish things like, first of all, Wuboku, but second of all, Solemn Judgment. And in talking to Falco after the tournament, they said that, the main sort of impetus behind making this deck was just to punish Solemn Judgment as much as possible. You've got the 3 Cannon Soldiers, you've got the extension that can sort of, go out of the box and sort of surprise your opponent after they've potentially committed a Solemn Judgment to a play that they think stops your turn entirely. There's just a lot of ways for this deck to really punish people playing Solemn Judgment and people playing Solemn Judgment poorly. And, I really do think that that is probably the main element of this deck's success. Maybe not the Gigatech Wolves and Cannon Soldiers. I'm pretty sure going through all the replays that they only summoned Labyrinth Tank once, and the one game that they did that, they actually lost. So maybe the Labyrinth Tank part of this deck isn't what people should be focusing on here, but more the sort of explosive nature of Cannon Soldier at 3 copies. I think that this deck is a really good argument for people upping the number of Cannon Soldiers that they're playing in general in the future, in no matter what deck they're playing. I think oftentimes when you face like a mass control deck and you get rid of your opponent's Cannon Soldier, you expect that they're out of Cannon Soldiers, because oftentimes mass control decks only play 1. But if you increase the number of Cannon Soldiers in the deck, you can catch your opponent by surprise and potentially go for some more explosive plays later, even after your first Cannon Soldier is gone. So I hope that more decks experiment with adding more Cannon Soldiers to their lists in the future, as I do think that this deck does really show how powerful it can be. I also don't want to discount the fusion part of the strategy. I do think that fusion summoning into a big beater can be very good. I mean, as I've said multiple times in this video, I have tried out a version of the fusion deck just going into Twin Head Thunder Dragon off of Muka Muka Turbo. I think that that version is very, very good, and I hope that this sort of success of Labyrinth Tank Turbo encourages people to experiment with that more. I do think that when a deck like this tops playing a lot of bricks on paper and playing a strategy that, doesn't really make sense to a lot of people, especially given conventional wisdom, it is really good to dive down into the reason why this deck actually had success. And I think that the triple Cannon Soldier really is the reason. So I really do hope that people learn from this deck, that they don't just dismiss it out of hand, because this deck is doing some things that did enable it to manage to have a great tournament run in the hands of a skilled player. That being said, I think I will try and play this deck on the channel in the future because it just is really sick. And I think it'll be fun just to try it out and see if the Gigatech Wolf Cannon Soldier parts, are bricks, or if the Labyrinth tank elements are better than I'm giving them credit for. So look forward to that in the future. Let me know your thoughts on this deck and the tournament as a whole in the comments down below. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.